So thanks for joining us all today. This is, as you all know by the fact that you're here, massively topical reform. It's affecting pretty much all UK projects and deals. There's multiple consultations currently in flight by NESO and Ofgem, and there's going to be more to come. All of these consultations are being done urgently. They're complex, they're interrelated, and they're very impactful for both new and existing projects. So we've gathered together. I co-head the energy regulatory team, and we have a team of, at least within our energy regulatory world, we have a team of 7 grid specialists, at least, for whom this is their day job. They're deeply involved in this and actively engaged with industry and clients. I'm very grateful to have 2 of my team leading the session today and sharing their knowledge and insights. We've got Rob Broom, a senior associate, and Sophie Lowe. I'll hand over to them in a second. The aim of this session is to give an overview of connections reform, aka TMO4+. We'll come on to what that means in a sec. What's been implemented already, so for instance, queue management and the LOA process, just to contextualize it, where we are currently with the consultations at this point in time, but also, as many will be aware, NESO released significant updates earlier this month, so the sort of famous 5 November document dump, and where we're going. So next steps. We've tried to pitch this session to be helpful for those relatively unfamiliar with the detail of the reforms or the latest updates, or have been meaning to catch up on it. So hopefully this is the catch up, and hopefully some material that will be still helpful for those deeper in it. So we do reach into some pockets where it's a bit of a deeper dive. There's areas of this reform that would warrant a whole session in themselves. You could do half a day easily. And there's exceptional cases to all the sort of general rules, and it's very easy to go down a rabbit hole. So what we're trying to do is remain focused on the core aspects of the proposal, and we'll fight our inner lawyer tendency to and try and oversimplify some areas and not unpack all of the nuances and exceptions along the way. So it's focused on, these are the core elements. There are some exceptions. We'll try and highlight, flag the exceptions so you're aware of it, but it's impossible to cover it all without bamboozling everyone. So the session will be recorded, and we'll send out the recordings and the slides afterwards. Q&A will also be open the whole time. We'll probably catch up on that at the end, or try and respond to things at the time. It may not be possible to get to all the questions, he says, knowing that that's going to be impossible. But we might follow up with a separate FAQ or something afterwards, or engage with you directly, either way. But an FAQ seems sensible, because a lot of the questions that get upvoted and stuff do tend to focus on similar things. So that's the session, and without further ado, I'll pass over to the team.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rob Broom, as Ben said. Delighted to be on this call with you today and to discuss a very topical issue. So we thought we'd just start off by having a look at the previous connection process and an overview as to how we've actually got to the current state that we're in today. So the previous connection process was very much a first come, first served approach. Developers could apply for their connection agreements at any time. Once they got a connection offer, they would then have 3 months to then review that and then either confirm if they accept or if they don't want it. And the actual form of offer that they would receive is a full connection offer. So it would provide them with a connection date, a point of connection, the associated works, as well as the cancellation charge or final sums if it's demand connection, and associated security. So the actual previous connection process has been the main driver as to the connection delays, and is also an associated high backlog. So currently, according to NESO statistics, as of October this year, there is a backlog of 750 gigawatts of capacity in the queue. Now, just to look back for a second, if we consider September 2023, there were 549 gigawatts of projects that held connection agreements across the system. Now, that comprised of 406 gigawatts of transmission and 143 gigawatts of distribution. Now, that 549 gigawatt amount was deemed by NESO at the time to be twice the amount required to be on the GB system at 2035. Now that's in September 2023. We're obviously now in November 2024, and we've got an upward lift of over 200 gigawatts of capacity in the queue since that time already. So clearly the connection process is not fit for purpose, and it's leading to various connection dates being pushed out into the late 2030s. And there was a key quote by the Right Honourable Claire Coutinho, which was, of course, the former Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero at the time, where she said effectively the current system allowed too many projects in the queue, simply that they wouldn't connect, and they were hoarding capacity effectively, preventing viable projects from connecting. So therefore, we are in the territory today where this is now as utmost importance for NESO, and clearly there will be a very big focus on bringing those queue levels down in order to accommodate what the GB system can.
And you can see that coming through in parts of the connection, the consultations. NESO, the noise from industry is the current proposals will in some ways affect investor confidence adversely, but they will also, NESO's point, which is quite valid, is the current issues are affecting investor confidence. Something needs to be done. So there is a net benefit to, delivering on a system that works in terms of investor confidence. Sorry, Rob.
Yeah, and we thought we'd add this figure here just to actually show how that connections queue stack is made up by technology type. And clearly you can see an abundance of solar and storage. So solar being the bright pink, and solar here in blue as well, comprising huge amounts in the queue. And obviously the levels, as I've mentioned, at the 750 gigawatt mark as of October. I'll now ask Sophie just to talk about some of the changes that have happened to date, just in the lead up to TMO4+.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. So just going to briefly touch on some of the changes that have been implemented to date, which have been implemented in an attempt to tackle some of the issues that Rob has just mentioned. And the two main changes are queue management and letters of authority. So starting with queue management, this was implemented on the 27th of November 2023, and it marked the beginning of NESO's hardening stance in relation to connection offers. The purpose of this was to weed out what NESO is calling the zombie projects, which is those projects that have stalled or slow moving and are blocking capacity. The process applies to all new grid connection offers and existing connection offers, except those which have a connection date prior to 27th of November 2025. It largely follows the queue management process, which has been implemented at the distribution level, and it requires developers to satisfy a set of milestones called the user progression milestones to evidence their progression of their project. These user progression milestones are split into conditional milestones, which require the user to apply for and obtain planning permission for their project, as well as secure the necessary land rights, and conditional milestones, which include things like agreeing a construction program with NESO and project commitment, so taking FID. These milestones are separate to the Appendix J or construction program milestones, which are already contained in developers' connection offers. And even though there's some overlap between the milestones, for example, both require the developer to obtain planning permission, the dates across both sets of milestones should align. The Appendix J milestones cover program-related activities in the developer's construction agreement, and these can generally be changed by agreement between NESO and a developer, for example, by an ATV. The user progression milestones, which will be contained in an aptly named Appendix Q, relate to the developer's commitment to the project. And the key difference between these two milestones is that NESO has clear termination rights if the user misses one of the user progression milestones, and the NESO must terminate if the developer's connection offer they must terminate the developer's connection offer where they fail to satisfy one of the conditional milestones, that milestones 1 to 3. But they have more discretion in terms of if one of the conditional milestones is missed.
Construction milestones.
Oh, sorry, construction milestones, yeah. Conversely, NESO doesn't usually have the right to terminate for missed Appendix J milestones, although we have started to see those rights being included in connection offers more recently. But one of the key points to note about queue management is that this is being slightly amended with the implementation of the connections reform, in particular milestone 1, which relates to applying for planning permission. So NESO is planning to update the queue management guidance and the relevant section in the CUSC once this has been implemented. So just to note that this is going to change slightly. Moving on to letters of authority, these have been required for transmission projects since the 28th of March 2024. It basically requires developers to evidence that they have either the land, that they are either the landowner or they have formally engaged with the landowner in respect of securing the land rights needed for their project. However, it doesn't require the developer to actually secure such rights. And the reason for this is basically to give NESO greater certainty about the developer's project at the earlier stages of the connections journey and to avoid speculative applications. And it basically ties the land into the project much more than it used to and in a much earlier stage in the process. It does currently apply only to onshore projects, but the proposals for connection reforms extends that to offshore projects as well. So I'll now pass you back over to Rob, and he'll talk about clean power. Oh, sorry, the TMO4 process a bit more.
Thanks, Sophie. Yes, so as I mentioned earlier, due to the fast-growing nature of the queue, where we've seen a significant increase, NESO later put forward a variation of the TMO4 approach, under which it was first ready and first connected, now to a first ready and needed, first connected. Now, this would apply the gate 2 to the existing transmissions connection queue. And the reason why NESO said that that was required is because it did not consider that TMO4 would improve the connection dates quickly enough in order to achieve the objectives set out in the connections action plan. So as I've mentioned, TMO4 Plus will apply to transmission projects as well as distribution projects, except it won't apply to distribution connected demand. It's a gated process under which a developer must satisfy criteria to pass from gate 1 to gate 2. And once a developer has accepted a gate 2 offer, it's worth noting that they will enter into an ongoing compliance phase where there will be ongoing land requirements and a requirement to submit project's application for planning consents. Now, there are 2 code modification proposal forms that have been prepared to implement TMO4+. We will make reference to these throughout the presentation, but it's CMP 434 and CMP 435. Both currently, as at today's date, are at the consultation date, and they're expected to be implemented in Q2 of 2025, but that's obviously subject to change. And prior to that, we are expecting Ofgem to come to its decision on those in Q1 of 2025.
And just to chip in, there are other code mods out there. There's like CMP, I think it's 95, and another one was dropped, and that's to do with the interface between NESO and NGET. There's consultations going on for license conditions, but to simplify it, CMP 434 and 435 are the main ones, and 434 is what's the new process look like, and 435 is how do we apply that process to the existing queue, which is the plus part of TMO4 plus. And then we've sort of got TMO4 plus now because the first needed bit has come in, but we'll come on to that. Sorry, Rob.
Yeah. I'll pass on to Sophie just to talk about clean power as well, because there's obviously, as Ben mentioned, there's been various updates. It's very much a fluid story. So, yep, Sophie, not to steal your thunder, I'll let you talk about CP30.
Oh, thanks, Rob. So before we get into the detail of the reforms, we thought it would be helpful to provide a brief overview of the Clean Power 2030, as this is now a key factor feeding into NESO's connections reform. So this as a result of Ofgem's letter in September this year, as it needs to be more focused on what is needed for the network in GB. So clean power is the government's mission to provide GB with clean power by 2030, whilst also maintaining security of supply. The government considers that a clean power system is one where demand is met by clean sources, with a key focus on renewables such as wind and solar, with reducing unabated gas generation to the lowest levels possible. The government formally asked NESO to provide its advice on how to achieve clean power by 2030, and NESO published its recommendations report on the 5th of November. We'll provide further details on NESO's recommendations a bit further on in this presentation, but the government is expected to provide its clean power plan by the end of this year. But so those details aren't out yet, but just to note that they are expected shortly.
Yeah. And digging into actually the advice recommendations in NESO's report, NESO identified 2 primary clean power pathways. These are under separate headings. So the first one is a further flex and renewables pathway. This involves the highest levels of societal engagement. The system operator said with higher residential and industrial demand flexibility and more storage. With the fast deployment of renewables under this FFR scenario, we're looking at 50 gigawatts of offshore wind added, but no new dispatchable power. The second pathway is a new dispatch pathway. So here is, under this scenario, we're looking at a growth in renewables, but at a lower level compared to the further flex and renewables. This obviously would involve the deployment of new low carbon dispatchable power, CCS and hydrogen, alongside the highest nuclear capacity for GB. In relation to gensets, obviously that's now looking at slightly lower scale than the 50 gigawatts of offshore wind. So here it's 43 gigawatts, but it also includes new dispatchable plants totaling 2.7 gigawatts using either hydrogen from low carbon sources or CCS. Interestingly enough, in the report presented to government, NESO recommended that the government consider a 10-year planning horizon, which should be split into 2 phases. So from the current time till 2030, which would be we've coined it CP phase 1, and then from 2031 to 2035 pathway, the CP 30 phase 2, acknowledging that there still are projects that will need to be built to service demand for GB in those forthcoming years.
And it's worth stating that National Grid, even if government doesn't include in Clean Power 2030, Clean Power 2035, National Grid and its new proposals does have an eye on the 2030 to 2035 projects and how they will be assessed. We'll come onto the queue later, but it's not awaiting government approval for how 2030 to 2035 projects are dealt with.
Yeah, and we've also just thought it would be helpful just to contextualize that with this image here. So to the left, we can see the generational mix in 2023. And to the right, we can see both pathways for 2030 aligned. So further flex and renewables, pathway 1, and new dispatch, pathway 2. So looking at offshore wind, which is sort of the dark green, that obviously is slightly lower because that's that 43 gigawatt figure that I mentioned. And obviously we have low carbon power, that's the dark blue right at the top of that bar. Interestingly, in both scenarios, that you can see the decrease of the gas generation as well, but also noteworthy that in terms of solar, the amount comprising from solar and onshore wind is consistent across both scenarios. Just a point to note on this is actually based on the current projections of GB's demand. So as with all these things and these topics related to grid connection reform, it may need to be revised as demand levels change, but it would be thought as again, it's helpful to sort of see how the system operator sees things looking ahead.
So looking at the gates in further detail, there'll be an annual application window for developers to apply for a Gate 1 offer. Developers will be required to submit a letter of authority as part of their Gate 1 application, which will include offshore projects. NESO will then review the Gate 1 applications on a competency basis and issue holding offers. And these holding offers will contain indicative connection dates and indicative points of connection only. So you won't get a queue position at this stage. Neither will you have a full suite of appendices to your construction agreement. And that also includes that you won't have any cancellation charge or final sums liabilities or a requirement to post security at this stage.
So it looks a bit like the step one offers that we've had under the transitional arrangements. It's the enduring solution for that. And one can of worms I just want to note is that the indicative connection point can cause quite a lot of issues for some projects because you don't have your confirmed, and that's an understatement. But you don't have a connection point at that stage confirmed, but you need a connection point to get planning, and you end up in this sort of catch-22. And all we can say is that is a can of worms. There's conversations going on in the context of the consultations about that and how it can be resolved.
Yeah, and then so once developers have a Gate 1 holding offer, they will then need to make an application to get to Gate 2. And they'll do this once they've considered they've satisfied the Gate 2 criteria, which we'll come on to shortly. NESO will assess Gate 2 applications in batches at regular intervals. This is currently proposed to be about 3 times a year, but that is still subject to change through the consultation process. If NESO is satisfied that a developer has satisfied the Gate 2 criteria, it will then issue a Gate 2 offer. And that Gate 2 offer will then be the fully fledged offer, and it will contain all of the relevant details and confirm the connection points, connection dates, all the works that are required. And this is the point at which the connection charges liability and final sums liability will be triggered, or that you'll become liable for it at that point, as well as having to secure security. And just to note, there is a 3-year time period that's being proposed between having a Gate 1 offer and accepting a Gate 2 offer, and that is a 3-year period. And that's just to make sure that developers don't languish in Gate 1 for too long, that they're incentivized to continue moving and progressing with their projects.
And again, on that, there's conversations going on that this is the new position for new connections. There'll be obviously in the first run when the existing queue has TM04+ come down on it, a slightly different process for how they batch them together. There's a much longer period, for instance. And I think the 3 per year, and you have a process where people might fall out and then they've got to do the network design. And then at the same time, or shortly after that, you've got a new window opening. There's question marks over how that will work practically when they're sending offers based on assumptions about who accepts the offer. So that's all being sort of considered in the round as to how often that is. And the 3-year long stop is something where if you currently have a firm offer and you go back to Gate 1, it might be that the 3 years doesn't apply. That's another thing that NESO is looking at. Again, just a pocket we won't go down in more detail on, but
so looking at the ready aspect of this, there are 2 routes to demonstrate that project is ready. Now these focus on securing land. So the first one is the land route. This involves securing the necessary land rights, land title, leasehold, or an option agreement, meeting the minimum acreage requirements, and providing a red line boundary for the site on which the project will be located. And that's referred to as the original red line boundary. The second route is the planning route, and that involves the submission of and validation of application for planning consents for project following the DCO process. Just an asterisk on that point, if a project is following the planning route, the requirement to meet the minimum acreage and the provision of the original red line boundary will need to be met later in the queue management M2 stage.
Diving into the detail of the land route a bit further, so developers will have to provide evidence that it holds the necessary land rights for the site on which the project will be located. And this means freehold ownership, leasehold, or has secured the right to own or lease the land. Importantly, exclusivity agreements and heads of terms will not suffice. Option agreements will suffice, but there is a 3-year minimum term requirement, which means that the land has to be secured under an option which is at least 3 years. But note, this requirement doesn't apply if the developer already has an option for the land at the go-live date of this connection reform, but thereafter it will have to make sure it keeps the land under option. And that's part of the ongoing compliance process, which we'll come on to later.
Just to be clear, sorry, just to be clear, the 3-year minimum term is the bit that won't apply, but you still have to have all the other stuff you need for an option or land rights, however you've ticked the box. Sorry, Sophie.
That's good. So the requirement relates to 100% of the land that the developer needs for its project, and this will be calculated using the energy density table that NESO has developed, and that will be broken down by technology. So there'll be a different energy density for a data center and compared to offshore wind or different technology. There is no exemption for developers who have to obtain land via CPO powers. And there are slight differences for onshore projects, and that requirement relates to the land for the onshore substation. One other key point to note is that NESO does recognise that often developers hold land and grid rights in separate entities, albeit kind of within a group, intragroup structure. And so provided that this can be clearly explained on the developer's Gate 2 application, NESO will consider it. So it shouldn't be a blocker that the land rights and the grid rights are held separately, provided there's a clear link between those two entities.
That said, it's great to see that. That's the first time with the November 5 docs that we saw that being clarified, but there's still not a huge amount of information on what is and is not going to be acceptable in that regard, but it's all about presenting the story, and what they'll be looking for is their land rights that make this project, viable and a link to it. So, yeah.
Yep. So if we take a look at what does needed mean, I think before we delve into this slide, just by way of context, Ofgem had released an open letter for interested parties on the 16th of September 2024. And it had mentioned in that letter that the further regulatory changes were actually going to be needed in addition to the ongoing TMO4+ code modification proposals to enable the connections process to be reformed such that whilst the current proposals are likely to reduce the queue, there is a risk noted by the regulator that reduction would not be sufficient and would be unlikely to deliver a technology mix that aligns with what GB is forecasted to need in 2030 or even 2050. Therefore, various license modifications the regulator mentioned would be required to ensure alignment between connections and the strategic planning demands of the GB energy system. And those new license conditions would provide for various methodologies, which feeds into this slide here. So we've got these following Gate 2 strategic alignment criteria. We've got a CP30 plan. So is the project aligned with the pathways within the government's CP 2030 action plan that Sophie elaborated on earlier? Is it a designated project? So this would be a project that's designated as such under the project designation methodology. That methodology would provide for a criteria for projects which are critical to the security of supply or system operability, and which would materially reduce system network constraints and therefore balancing costs on consumers, and or are innovative or emerging technologies, or have particularly long lead times. And in the third category, we've got transmission demand projects, which are not within the CP30 plan. Both the CP30 plan and the transmission demand projects not within the CP30 plan will be set out in the connections network designed methodology, and that would set out the process and criteria also for queue formation with enduring Gate 2 application windows and reallocation of capacity following termination. Just a point to note, the very last bullet point of this slide, this is not required to be evidenced by the user, but it is identified and confirmed to the user by NESO. So that's just a point to note point to note here.
So the main one we'll be focusing on is alignment with CP30 plan. Designated projects is a bit of an exceptional case. And I suppose the one about being outside of the CP30 plan, the main application of that is data center, transmission connected data centers.
Yeah.
So going into what is required to be evidenced in terms of the Gate 2 criteria, and this slide focuses on new applications going through the process after TMO4 rather than to the existing queue, which we'll come on to in a minute. But so this just focuses on the new applications. The developer will be required to provide a readiness declaration signed by a director, and that what was the self-declaration letter before in NESO's previous reforms, if you were familiar with that. So it's just changed slightly to focus on the readiness criteria. So this will require the developer to confirm the date on which the project achieved the Gate 2 criteria. They'll then have to provide the red line boundary for the project site, the land status information, for example, how it's held, whether it's under option or if you've got a lease or if you own it, a statement to the director's best of knowledge that the developer is not applying for both the transmission and distribution connection to the same land. And the developer will also have to provide the documentary evidence that holds that land. But NESO does recognise that there'll be a lot of commercial sensitive information contained in those documents. So they do allow the developers to upload redacted documentation. And just a couple of asterisks on these slides. NESO is in the process of developing a pro forma readiness declaration, and that's going through as as part of the consultation. So developers will be able to use that pro forma when making their Gate 2 application. And the other asterisks, where there's two asterisks, so the red line boundary and the land status information, developers won't need to provide this information as part of their Gate 2 application if they're going down the planning route. That information will be supplied later down the line once they go through the ongoing compliance process. So yes, now I'll pass you over to Rob, who will talk to you about what is required for existing connection offers.
Thanks, Sophie. Yes, so for users in the existing queue, the developer will need to provide a readiness declaration that will need to be signed by a director. There are some similarities with this. So effectively, it would need to identify the date which the project achieved the Gate 2 readiness criteria. It would also need to notify if the user wishes to advance its current contracted connection date, or if it would want to reduce its current tech or developer capacity, and if so, to what number. Obviously, we've noted in brackets that there are cancellation charge and final sums liability for where that would occur. Or indeed, if the user would like to amend the connection point location. We've added an asterisk next to the change to the current contracted connection date. There is a Wacom proposal currently in play now where it's contemplated that there will be a 2 to 4 week pause for Gate 2 qualified projects to assess the viability of their projects in light of their competitor information. So effectively, this period would be introduced so that once projects that got through the Gate 2, they can assess who is in their pot to determine whether that project wants to advance their connection date, or perhaps start as is, or withdraw without penalty.
For those coming into this a bit colder than others, I think that will become a bit clearer once we show how you go through the pots and how the pot's divided into sub-pots, and it all gets very complicated. And also for those not deeply involved in the CUSC modification processes, or WACM is one of the best acronyms, but it's basically an alternative that the work groups ensure, as an alternative that the work groups decide on to present for consideration, and so it's possible that this will be passed. I think it's relatively likely, I think.
Yeah, and there are further evidence requirements that we've set out on this slide here. So obviously the red line boundary of the project site will need to be identified. Land status information, also, for example, the length of an option agreement or the lease. The directors will need to provide a statement that, to the best of their knowledge, they are not applying for both a transmission and distribution connection for the same land. And just to note, as Sophie mentioned earlier, evidence can be redacted to address commercial sensitivities when they are being provided to NESO. We have added an asterisk next to the land status information bullet points here, just to note that it's not applicable if the developer is seeking to meet Gate 2 readiness criteria via the submission and validation of the application for a planning consent. I'll pass to Sophie now, who will look at NESO's example of the application of the Gate 2 readiness criteria to the existing queue.
Thanks, Rob. So this is the process whereby NESO will apply the Gate 2 readiness criteria to the existing queue, and this is known as the Gate 2 to whole queue process. So I don't propose to go through each line here, but it's just to sort of give you a flavour of what NESO will do. The key point is to note that NESO will have a look at the existing queue and look at the projects that have submitted Gate 2 readiness criteria. If NESO is satisfied that they have satisfied the Gate 2 criteria, those projects will then go green, shown in the green tiles, and projects which haven't satisfied that criteria will be taken out, so that's the black tiles. And then that queue will then be bunched back up based on the original queue position, and that queue position is determined on when NESO countersigned their connection offer for transmission projects. And if you are a DNO connected project that have gone through the project progression process, then that's the date that NESO signed the project progression mod offer. So once NESO's done this and it's got through this and it's come down to the revised queue, it will then look at the zonal sub-queues. And this is where they start looking at applying the strategic alignment criteria. And so in its recommendations that we discussed earlier, NESO has advised that the CP30 plan should set out pathways from now until 2030, and then a pathway from 2031 to 2035. Within these pathways, they'll be created zonal sub-queues. So there'll be 14 distribution sub-queues, and they will be based on the DNO regions which exist today. And then there will be 17 transmission sub-zones which are still under consultation, and they will be formally confirmed by the government in its plan later this year. So out of these zones, there will be sub-queues for each technology, which will create sort of the technology pots. And these are still under development, but it's worth noting that, or NESO has noted that there might be, for some technologies, there may only be one zone, or like a GB-wide subzone rather than a specific zone within a certain geographic area. Each pot will have a limit for each technology. So once NESO has allocated projects within that technology for that subzone and that limit is reached, then the projects that fall after that point will go back to sort of Gate 1. They won't get a Gate 2 offer at that stage.
So just to, because this is, sorry, just go back, Sophie, a sec, or the slides. So I know there's a lot of differing opinions on how these zones will be split and whether it makes sense to have distribution zones different to transmission zones and all sorts of things. But yeah, so the pot will be split into technology. That's conceptually fine. And we also know it's going to be split into zones, but it'll also be split along distribution and transmission lines. So if you're a distribution BESS project in Southeast, you'll be in your zonal sub-queue with other distribution connected battery projects in the Southeast competing for that pot of the amount of power in that, or amount of batteries in that area at distribution level that government has decided is needed for CP30. And then, likewise for offshore wind connected in Scotland, that's directly connected to the transmission network. They'll have their own queue that will be reordered and cut up. So there's a lot of key detail there as to how those pots look and how much capacity is in each one that's yet, and even just the basic rules as to how the zones are going to be split up. There's a direction of travel, but it's not been decided yet. That's critical detail to figure out how you fit in your area for a project. I just want to pause on that. So if we go over to the next slide before maybe getting in the weeds.
Yeah, and in its webinar on the 5th of November, NESO did provide a very helpful example, which we thought we'd also include in our presentation today for those that weren't able to attend that. So this is an example of aligning the queue to the CP30 pathways. So here, if we look at the first grey line of 15 projects, this is effectively a sub queue for each technology in a zone. And each of these projects have met their Gate 2 criteria for land rights. In the second stage, projects will be asked if they want to advance their connection dates, i.e. if they want an acceleration or not. So that's the remaining grey. Then for those projects that have said that they don't, they're highlighted in blue, and they're sort of formed out of this phase. Then NESO.
Sorry, Rob, if I can just clarify.
Yep.
So if you had a 2029 date, you don't need to apply for acceleration to remain in the grey because you're already in the 2030 pathway. It's if you were 2031 to 35 and would otherwise have been going blue, you can ask to go earlier to get in the grey.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a very key point. Looking at the next 3 rows, there's effectively a review of the planning status of the remaining projects. So they are considered in a priority stack. So here we've got green projects highlighted in green, which have planning, orange, which have submitted their planning, and red, which have secured land rights. These, well, effectively after this is reordered in a priority stack, there is then a realignment where phase 1 projects are returned to their original relative queue positions. So if we turn our eyes to sort of phase 7 here, and then oversupply projects are then identified. So this is in phase 8 where NESO determine in the phase 2 queue where the 2035 pathway is reached. If there's any exceeding that pathway, they won't receive a Gate 2 offer. So you can see projects 10, 12, and 15 here highlighted in blue at the end did not receive a Gate 2 offer. It's a complicated process. I think the key takeaway from us was that NESO is trying to intend to make this as fair as possible, especially when there are sort of a lot of projects that are moving in to form the queue. But it's a helpful example just to contextualize some of the things that we've been discussing earlier. I'll now just.
I think sorry, Rob. I think the key stages. I mean, they're all key stages, but one of the key ones is the fact that you're all past Gate 2, but there's a surplus of projects compared to the amount that NESO or the government think is required for CP30 for that zone. Then the role of the planning status takes over to figure out the order of the queue, which, although planning's not a requirement for Gate 2, if you're in an oversubscribed zone, it suddenly becomes very important depending on how oversubscribed it is. And then in point 6 there, that black dotted line, that's where they carve up. So the last project, project 8, is the last one needed for that pot. And I think they've said that if 8 was too big, you put in 8 and it's too big for the pot, they'll still put 8 in. But you can see there, project 6, which was looking like it had a relatively good position, has found itself out because of planning status. I think this is a relatively extreme example that I've chosen here, just for the example purposes, but it makes it quite important to figure out your relative spot in the queue and your planning status. And then another key point is, although they've all been jumbled up in stage 6, when they return them to their queue in 7, you keep your original spot. So 13 hasn't actually overtaken 5 in the final wash up. And there's a lot of complication around how that applies to distribution projects and there's a big sub argument going on about what's fair in terms of when the project progression was submitted to NESO versus when you signed the distribution offer. But we won't unpack all that now, but it's just enough to see the process and some key parts of it. And the idea is that those projects that have found themselves, so 11, 6, 14, and the other blue projects that have found themselves in 2030, the idea in principle is that those are waiting in the wings if one of the 2030 projects falls over and has its offer, say, terminated because it hasn't satisfied an Appendix Q milestone, then the next cab off the rank, which would be 11, would fill its spot. To oversimplify it massively, but that's the idea. Sorry, Rob. Next.
No, thank you very much, Ben. And also now just to we've mentioned sort of various different timelines here. We just thought it might be helpful now just to remind the audience that in respect of CMP 434, 435, so that those custom modification proposals, we are expecting an Ofgem decision in Q1 of 2025. The go live date for TMO4 Plus will be Q2 2025. In relation to Gate 2 applying to the whole queue exercise, just to note, project developers in the existing queue will be provided with a 2-week window, occurring no less than 4 weeks from the implementation date into the codes, to submit a Gate 2 declaration application and their readiness evidence. NESO will review that evidence and then work with the transmission owners and distribution network operators to establish the connections queue, also applying the Gate 2 strategic alignment criteria. And then NESO will start to issue offers under the Gate 2 to the whole queue exercise by the end of 2025. And we've also just added a quick bullet at the end to say, effectively, NESO will run the process for new applications simultaneously. So that will be happening in the background as well. So just some key points to note in terms of look ahead.
Some of those dates, like the Ofgem decision could be delayed, which would have a knock-on effect for all of these other timelines. And by go live, that's the implementation date. That's when you trigger the 4 weeks before the 2-week window opens. And so, yeah, the sort of process is still a little bit up in the air, but at least they've given indications of, okay, once we get the Ofgem decision, then what sort of timelines are we working to? And there's also sub-phases in here that we haven't unpacked the full detail of. But for instance, after the Gate 2 window, so the 2-week window, there'll be a period where National Grid assesses whether the information you provided passes basic tests and has it back and forwards for a while and confirms that you've passed the competency, you've submitted a competent application. And that's after that, that's not when you get your Gate 2 offer, that's when the dust is settled and they start doing their queue chopping and changing and the reordering, and then their further network analysis and things that they do to get the final offers out by the end of 2025. I mean, they've said they'll work as fast as possible to get offers out, but the end of 2025 seems most likely.
Yeah, so once NESO has issued the Gate 2 offers, users will be required to comply with this ongoing compliance process. And this is split into sort of land requirements and planning requirements. So in terms of the land requirements, where the developer has secured the land under an option agreement, it's required to then continue to keep that land under option. There are also requirements in terms of what developers can do in terms of changing the development site or the project site within the red line boundary. So compliance will always go back to what was submitted as part of the red line boundary. And we consider this to be probably more of an issue for developers that have submitted a smaller red line boundary and then make changes to their project such that their project falls outside of that red line boundary, as opposed to project developers that have overestimated their site at the original red line boundary stage and then develop a slightly smaller project within that boundary. So there's quite complicated rules on if you build outside of your red line boundary, what happens to that capacity, which we won't go into too much detail here, but the basic rule is that only 50% of that number can be, in your original capacity, can be built outside of that red line boundary. Beyond that, you will lose that capacity and have to go back to gate 1 to get that capacity back. So moving on to the planning requirements, if you didn't submit, if you went down the land route at gate 2 criteria, you'll then have to submit, you'll then have to provide evidence that you've submitted your planning application as part of the queue management process. And so NESO is looking at amending the milestone 1 as part of queue management, such that the developer is required to apply for their planning permission at the earliest of the date calculated backwards from the connection date, which is how it's currently calculated, or the M1 calculated forwards from the date of the gate 2 offer. And we've been looking at this recently, and it seems that it'll only really apply, the forward-looking milestone will only really apply to projects that have quite a late connection date that's sort of beyond 2030. Those connection offers will, their current M1 would usually fall before that date if it was calculated forwards.
There are, so for instance, to give that some more color, so the calculator back from contracted completion date would be your existing at queue dates. If you apply for an earlier completion date, then that would be updated and come forward. And if you get a later completion date as a result of this, then it would also be adjusted. But it tends to be, it's in the range of what, 18 months to 3 years prior to the contracted completion date, depending on a load of things. But then the forward-looking one, let's assume that as per the previous slide, gate 2 offers are come out at the end of 2025. That means that for the quickest planning standard, what they've considered to be the standard time, which is town and country planning, you go, the milestone would be 2 years after that date. But once you're looking at projects in the pre-2030 window that have already got a backwards calculated M1 based on, let's say, 2029, you end up meeting in the middle, or the existing one is probably the earlier. Just as maybe that's made it less clear, but it's mostly an issue for projects with 2030 dates or beyond, with some exceptions.
Yeah, and NESO should have, well, the proposals are that NESO will have discretion to disapply the forward-looking milestone if it would mean that the developer is required to apply for planning permission objectively too early for that kind of project. There are also other requirements you'll also be required to continue to apply with the queue management milestones. The full suite of the queue management milestones. And if you're DNO connected, then queue management will be monitored by the DNO or the IDNO, which you have a connection offer with.
Yes, so in addition, there are also proposals from NESO for a capacity commitment fee, CCF. Now, this will be applicable to all projects that have accepted their Gate 2 offer under the TMO4 Plus arrangement. So NESO recently, as of the 5th of November, released a call for input. Responses to those were due by the 22nd of November. Now, in terms of the current proposal, it works, it's triggered much like the current cancellation charge, in that developers will be liable for the CCF on either terminating their connection or reducing their transmission entry capacity prior to energization. Just to note on this, the current cancellation charge regime that takes effect in connection agreements will remain, and both it and the CCF will operate in tandem. Now, NESO have proposed a figure of the CCF of 20,000 per megawatt, and therefore, obviously, the CCF presents very significant costs for developers. So if a developer, for example, was to hold 1 gigawatt of transmission capacity, that could result in an overall CCF of 20 million. You know, and some say that that sum might be significantly higher than the development costs of the projects themselves. Now, where the CCF does apply, developers will be required to post security with NESO in respect of that liability, again, much like the cancellation charge secured amount. As we've mentioned here, this does not apply to DNO connected and transmission demand projects. I did want to just very quickly mention there is a net off against the cancellation charge amount. So in order to avoid excess security requirements, the proposal from NESO is that developers will be only required to post the higher of the CCF or the cancellation charge secured amount. So the suggestion is that a developer, you know, it will only be the higher of those two that apply.
So think of it like a floor on the security, so a minimum amount that's 20,000 per megawatt, and then once your cancellation charge profile goes above that amount, just due to the natural course of things, you'd still be liable for the CCF, but it doesn't increase the security. It's still a significant proposal, obviously, but that's a feature of it. And also worth stressing that this is not part of the formal consultations currently. It's a call for input. And one thing NESO is pausing on it, they've taken it out of this formal consultation and put it in this call for input. They're pausing on the need for it and the quantum, given the other changes, because one of the things it's trying to get at is capacity sellers and you know, hoarders of capacity that are not buying capacity for their own project or otherwise sitting on it. And a lot of the other changes, for instance, the red line boundary and, you know, the other gate 2 requirements, limit that kind of behavior as it is. So they're looking for evidence. That part of this process has been looking for evidence on whether this is needed.
Yeah, and just very quickly to mention, in addition to what Ben said, is this has all arisen because in addition to the project ready and strategic need criteria, NESO is, you know, effectively is contemplating whether developers should provide appropriate financial commitment when they received a committed capacity and a place in the queue, and effectively that the lack of existing financial commitments has allowed, in NESO's view, the rise of speculative reseller projects to enter and remain in the queue, which obviously has led into the increased connection delays, which I referred to on the first slide of this webinar. So yes, very much as Ben says, call for input now, and obviously we'd see what emerges from that. We have included links to the appreciate we've mentioned a lot of documents here, so just to make it easier for everybody when these are circulated, there are links to the various documents as well, so you'd be able to sort of direct yourself to a particular part of those that we've given an overview. But I think at this point I'll just hand over for any questions, if we can squeeze a few.
Yeah, noting that we're up against time. We've had a few questions trickle in on the chat, which I answered one of them live. Gated process work for distribution. So there's two parts of the interplay with distribution. There's one, how the new process will apply, and it's not correct to say that there'll be no NESO involvement. If you trigger transmission works, then there's a process where the DNOs will have to apply this process, a variation of this process with NESO. So it's not true to say that there's no NESO involvement. And for the existing projects, the distribution projects, where they have a transmission system impact, they will still have to satisfy these criteria. Exactly how it flows down is still not entirely clear. Some people may have a clearer view than we do, but I think that there's a lot of consultation still yet to be done with just DNOs and led by the ENA on exactly how that works. And I think there's been a bit of a catch-22 on starting that until more detail and the sort of big pieces of the main transmission reform have become more settled so that you can flow it down. But essentially, in very high level, the DNOs have to submit the relevant evidence, for land rights and alignment on the developer's behalf. So there's another step in the chain, and one of the things they're thinking about is how the timing of that will all work. Is it the same for directly connected, or when you're going through a DNO or a transmission connected IDNO? Does that need more time or more sort of allowance for that process? Vegas and Bellas will be subject to the process. To answer another question, DNO connected generation projects with Vegas or Bellas, they will fall into they're still a distribution project, but you'll have these requirements in respect of your Bega and your Bella. Rob, there's one on CCF that does not apply to DNO connected generation. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head.
I think we've mentioned that in the slide. Yeah, we've mentioned it does not apply to DNO connected and transmission demand projects.
Based on the call for input, so it's all up in the air.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, some of this is necessarily high level given the nature of it, but we're happy to take any. We'll probably have to close it off there, but we're happy to take any other questions directly after this, and hopefully it was a useful session to give you all an overview of how it's working and the key bits that we do know, but also the key bits that we don't know still, and which are still being worked on. So we'll wrap it up there, and thanks very much all for your time.